Time has never been questioned because it has never waited for us to ask. It moves forward while we are born into it, while we learn its rhythm without consent, while our bodies grow accustomed to its pull. Morning follows night, childhood follows birth, death waits at the end like a silent punctuation mark. Everything feels ordered. Everything feels irreversible. And yet, this certainty is not something we discovered. It is something we inherited. Imagine, for a moment, that time does not flow forward at all. Not everywhere. Not always. Imagine a region of the universe where events do not unfold, but fold back into themselves, where the arrow we call time bends, hesitates, and then quietly turns around. No explosion, no announcement, just a different direction. In that place, a star does not begin as a blazing furnace. It begins as scattered ash, cold fragments drifting apart. Slowly, impossibly, those fragments move closer. Heat does not escape, it returns. Light does not travel outward, it falls back home. The star grows younger as it brightens, more ordered as it pulls itself together, until finally it collapses into silence, not because it died, but because it was just born. To us, this sounds like fantasy, a poetic reversal, a dream logic that only exists when the mind loosens its grip on reason. But the universe has never promised to make sense in the way our stories do. We live inside a narrative that moves from beginning to end. Our language is built around it. Our memories depend on it. Our science assumes it. Past, present, future. Three clean compartments that make existence feel navigable. Yet beneath that comfort, there is a quiet problem. The fundamental laws of physics do not care which direction time moves. At the deepest level we can measure, the equations that govern motion, energy, and matter do not distinguish between forward and backward. They work just as well in reverse. If you were to watch the universe play backward at the level of particles and forces, nothing in those equations would object. No alarm would sound. The universe itself would not notice. Only we would. Because what convinces us that time flows forward is not physics. It is memory. It is decay. It is the slow accumulation of disorder we call entropy. Cups shatter, but never reassemble. Smoke disperses, but never gathers itself back into flame. We take these patterns as proof, as law. But what if they are only local habits? What if the arrow of time is not a universal command, but a regional tendency, something that emerges under certain conditions and dissolves under others? In a universe vast enough, old enough, and strange enough, there may be places where entropy decreases, where disorder gives way to structure, where the future becomes more predictable than the past. In such a place, memory would not work the way it does here. A mind evolving under reverse time would not remember what we call yesterday. It would remember what we call tomorrow. Experiences would feel like confirmations rather than discoveries. Knowledge would precede action. Meaning would appear before cause. A being might remember its own death long before it experiences its first breath. And death itself would no longer feel like an ending. It would feel like an origin point, a moment from which life unravels backward, gradually shedding complexity, slowly returning borrowed energy to the cosmos. This idea is unsettling not because it is violent or catastrophic, but because it is calm. Nothing breaks, nothing explodes. The universe simply follows a different direction, and suddenly, everything we rely on to define reality, progress, growth, purpose, causality, loses its fixed orientation. Here is the deeper discomfort. If time can flow backward somewhere else, then forward is not a property of time itself. It is a property of us. Our brains are built to record increasing entropy. Our memories stack in one direction because our biology depends on it. We experience time the way a river experiences gravity inevitably and without choice. But rivers do not define gravity. They merely obey it. So, what happens if consciousness arises in a region where the current runs the other way? Would such beings see us as living in reverse? Would our births look like dissolutions? Would our lives appear as slow erasures rather than creations? From their perspective, we might look like creatures undoing ourselves, step by step, moving steadily toward a state of perfect simplicity. And perhaps, from a neutral vantage point, outside time altogether, neither of us would be wrong. This is the moment where most stories stop, where speculation becomes too abstract, too uncomfortable, too untethered from everyday life. But this is exactly where the question becomes dangerous in the best possible way. Because if time's direction is not absolute, then neither is meaning. We often believe meaning comes from moving forward, from building, achieving, accumulating, from leaving something behind, a legacy, a trace. But in a reversed time universe, meaning would not be about leaving marks. It would be about erasing them gently, about returning complexity to simplicity with care, about knowing that every structure is temporary and that dissolution is not failure, but fulfillment. Progress would be measured by how gracefully something comes apart. Growth would be defined as reduction, and life would not be a climb towards something new, but a slow remembering of something ancient. This is where our instincts resist, because everything in us wants time to be a one-way street. We want causes before effects. We want effort to lead to reward. We want pain to lead to learning, not the other way around. So let me pause here, not to soften the idea, but to sharpen it. If you are still listening, if this question is unsettling you, just enough to keep you awake while your body wants to sleep, then this quiet space matters. This channel exists to explore ideas like this slowly, carefully, without rushing toward answers that feel safe. If you find value in drifting here, take a moment to support this place. Like this video, share it with someone who enjoys falling asleep inside impossible questions, and subscribe to Whispers of the Universe so we can keep returning to these edges together. Now let's continue. The strangest part is not that time might flow backwards somewhere. The strangest part is that we cannot prove it doesn't. All of our observations are local. All of our measurements are bound to the direction our instruments, our memories, and our expectations already assume. We look for traces of the past because that is what our minds are tuned to recognize. We search for causes behind effects because that is how our survival depends on understanding the world. But the universe has no obligation to match our survival strategies. There may be regions so distant, so disconnected from our cosmic neighborhood, that time behaves differently without ever leaving a detectable signature. Entire histories could be unfolding in reverse, never intersecting with our forward-flowing narrative. And even closer to home, the boundary between forward and backward may not be sharp. It may blur. It may fluctuate. It may reverse briefly, locally, quietly, in ways too subtle for us to notice. If that is true, then the universe is not a story with a beginning and an end. It is a structure with many directions, many flows, many interpretations, layered on top of the same underlying reality. And consciousness, our consciousness, may simply be the sensation of being carried along one particular current. As you listen now, time still feels like it is moving forward. Your breath flows in and out. Thoughts arise and fade. The body prepares for rest. But beneath that familiar rhythm, a question has been planted. What if time is not carrying you forward at all? What if you are drifting through a field where direction is an illusion created by memory, and where the universe itself remains perfectly indifferent to which way the story is told? Hold that thought lightly, because once we accept the possibility that time can flow backward, we are forced to ask something even quieter and far more unsettling. If the arrow of time is not fundamental, then what exactly is? Memory does not feel like a mystery because it arrives already labeled. We call it the past. We trust it instinctively. We build our identity on it. We say things like, "This happened, that shaped me. This is who I am now because of what came before." Memory feels solid, directional, obedient. It points backward with confidence, as if it were a natural law rather than a biological habit. But memory has never been proof of time's direction. It has only been evidence of how we survive inside it. Imagine waking up with a memory that has no emotional weight yet. A memory that feels unfinished. Not nostalgia, not trauma, not warmth or regret, just information waiting to be confirmed. A recollection without meaning, suspended like an unopened letter. Now imagine that memory becomes clearer only after the event occurs. In our world, experience writes memory. But this is not the only possible arrangement. It is simply the one we evolved inside. What we call memory is not a recording of the past. It is a process, a physical reconfiguration of matter inside the brain. Neurons strengthen certain connections. Chemical gradients settle into patterns. Energy is spent to preserve information. And that process crucially depends on entropy increasing. Memory is expensive. It requires disorder to grow elsewhere so that order can grow inside the mind. This is why memory always points backward here. Not because time demands it, but because entropy does. If entropy were to decrease, even locally, memory would not just behave differently. It would reverse its orientation. In such a region, a mind could form stable neural patterns that correspond not to what has happened, but to what will happen. These patterns would feel just as real, just as convincing, just as personal. The being would remember events that have not yet occurred, and experience would feel like the gradual confirmation of something already known. To us, this sounds impossible, but only because we are confusing familiarity with necessity. At the fundamental level, the equations governing matter do not forbid memory of the future. They only describe relationships between states. They do not label one state as before and another as after. That labeling is something we impose after the fact, guided by the direction entropy happens to take around us. The universe itself does not remember. It does not anticipate. It simply exists in configurations. Memory is something that arises when configurations are preserved against decay, and decay has a direction only under certain conditions. This is where the discomfort deepens. If memory is directional only because entropy is, then memory is not a window into objective time. It is a shadow cast by local physics onto consciousness, which means our strongest intuition about reality may be our least reliable guide to its structure. Consider how confidently we say that the past is fixed and the future is open. We treat this as obvious, as self-evident. But this belief comes entirely from the way memory accumulates in one direction. We cannot remember the future, so we assume it does not yet exist. But inability is not proof. A reverse time mind would make the opposite assumption with equal confidence. It would remember what we call the future and find the past unsettlingly vague, unstable, and indeterminate. From that perspective, our certainty about the past would look naive, even arrogant. They might say, "Of course you think the past is fixed. You remember it clearly." But clarity is not truth. It is just what your memory system happens to preserve, and they would be right. This inversion does something subtle and dangerous to our understanding of causality. In our experience, memory follows cause. We touch fire, then we remember pain. The sequence feels natural, but this sequence is not written into the universe. It is written into how information stabilizes inside our brains. If memory pointed forward, causality would feel reversed. Knowledge would arrive before action. Intention would feel like recollection. Choice would feel like recognition rather than decision. A being might remember choosing something long before the choice becomes physically enacted. Free will would not disappear in such a universe, but it would feel entirely different. It would feel less like creating something new and more like aligning with something already known. This raises a quiet question that we rarely dare to ask. Is our sense of freedom tied to time's direction? We often believe freedom means openness, many possible futures branching ahead. But this belief rests on the assumption that the future is unknown. If the future were remembered instead, freedom might feel like inevitability, accepted willingly. Inevitability, when embraced rather than resisted, does not feel like a prison. It feels like clarity. This is not philosophy drifting away from science. It is science pressing gently against the limits of intuition. When physicists examine time at the smallest scales, they do not find a flowing river. They find relationships, correlations, constraints. Time emerges as a parameter we use to describe change, not as a substance moving on its own. And memory is how consciousness navigates those descriptions. If memory flipped, navigation would flip with it. The deeper implication is unsettling in a quieter way. If memory orientation defines how a conscious being experiences reality, then there is no single correct way to experience time. There is only a way that fits the local conditions. Reality does not privilege our experience. It merely accommodates it. Somewhere in the universe, or perhaps layered invisibly within the same space, there could exist conscious systems whose memories point in directions we cannot imagine. Not forward, not backward, possibly sideways across configurations we do not even perceive as temporal. For them, our obsession with beginnings and endings might seem strange. Why cling to origins when everything is already known? Why fear endings when they are merely points of highest clarity? This is where the idea stops feeling abstract and starts feeling personal, because our identity is memory. Remove memory, and the self dissolves. Change memory's direction, and the self transforms into something unrecognizable. If you remembered your last breath more vividly than your first, how would you live? Would urgency disappear or intensify? Would love feel fragile or inevitable? Would fear lose its grip or gain a new one? We assume that knowing the future would paralyze us. But that assumption comes from imagining future knowledge inside a forward time mind. A mismatch, a contradiction. A reversed time mind would not experience foresight as intrusion. It would experience it as structure, as grounding. Just as we feel grounded by remembering where we came from, the most destabilizing thought is not that such minds could exist. It is that their experience would be just as valid as ours. The universe would not rank one above the other. It would not assign truth to forward memory and illusion to backward memory. It would simply host both as consistent outcomes of different physical conditions. And that means our confidence about time's direction rests on something far thinner than we like to admit. It rests on habit. As you listen now, your mind is still collecting memories in the familiar way. Each sentence settles behind you. Each idea becomes something you have heard. But that very sensation, the feeling of accumulation, is not a universal feature of consciousness. It is a local phenomenon. And local phenomena, in a universe this vast, are never the full story. If memory can point forward somewhere else, then what we call the past may not be a universal archive. It may be just one orientation among many, which leads us gently, inevitably, toward the next fracture in our assumptions. If memory does not define the past, then what, exactly, defines cause and effect? And how stable is the idea that causes must come first at all? Cause and effect feel so natural that we rarely notice how much effort it takes to believe in them. We grow up inside a world where explanations move in one direction. Something happens, and then something else follows. A push leads to motion. A spark leads to fire. A decision leads to consequence. This order feels not only logical, but moral. Responsibility itself is built on it. You did this, therefore that happened. Causality is not just how we understand the universe, it is how we assign meaning, blame, purpose, and control. And yet, like time and memory, causality may not be as fundamental as it feels. Imagine watching a glass shatter on the floor. The sound comes first, sharp and final. Then, impossibly, the shards begin to tremble. They slide back into position. Cracks seal themselves. The glass lifts from the ground and settles whole into an unseen hand. To us, this looks like a violation, a reversal, a miracle. But at the level of physical law, nothing has been broken. Every particle obeys the same equations. Every interaction is permitted. What has changed is not the rules, but the direction in which we are reading them. We say the cause is the glass falling, and the effect is the shattering. But physics itself does not label these moments. It simply connects states. One configuration transitions into another according to relationships that do not care which one we call first. End quote. Causality, like time, is something we infer after the fact. This inference works remarkably well in our environment because entropy increases, disorder spreads, information disperses, causes leave traces behind them. Effects do not usually leave clear traces ahead of them, so we learn to look backward for explanations. But this is a strategy, not a law. In a region where entropy decreases, the landscape of traces would flip. Effects would leave clearer imprints than causes. Information would concentrate rather than spread. And the most reliable way to explain the present would be to look toward what we would call the future. In such a place, causality would not disappear. It would reverse its orientation. An event would feel explained not by what led to it, but by what it leads into. Purpose would not be something assigned afterward. It would be something remembered in advance. This challenges a deeply rooted assumption that causes must come before effects. But that assumption is psychological before it is physical. At the fundamental level, interactions are symmetric. Particles collide. Fields influence one another. The equations allow these interactions to be traced forward or backward with equal validity. What we call cause and effect are labels we assign based on which direction feels stable to our memory systems. This is why causality feels so solid and yet becomes so fragile under scrutiny. The universe does not announce causes. It does not flag effects. It does not draw arrows between moments. It simply exists as a network of relationships that can be navigated from many directions. We navigate it from one, and we mistake our navigation for the terrain itself. If causality can flip, then intention becomes a strange object. In our experience, intention precedes action. We decide, then we act. The feeling of choice sits comfortably at the front of the sequence. But if causality were reversed, intention might feel like something that arrives after the action but is remembered before it. A being might act, and only later by our standards feel the intention that explains that action. To them, this would not feel delayed. It would feel ordered, just as our own intentions feel ordered to us. Even though neuroscience shows that decisions often begin forming before we are consciously aware of them, this detail matters because it suggests that even in our forward time world, causality is not as clean as it feels. The brain initiates actions milliseconds before the mind claims ownership. The effect begins before the cause becomes conscious. We already live with small reversals. We simply ignore them because they are uncomfortable. Now stretch this idea beyond milliseconds, beyond brains, beyond biology. Imagine a universe where large-scale structures form because they are pulled into existence by future constraints, where galaxies assemble not because of past explosions alone, but because of boundary conditions that lie ahead in time. This is not science fiction. Variations of this idea appear quietly in theoretical physics, often framed cautiously, buried under mathematics to avoid sounding absurd. But the implication is simple. The universe may not be driven solely by what has already happened. It may also be shaped by what must eventually happen. In such a framework, causality becomes a negotiation rather than a command. Past and future both exert influence, meeting in the present like opposing currents. From inside that meeting point, time feels directional, but the direction may be emergent, not absolute. This reframes something we rarely question: inevitability. We fear inevitability because we associate it with loss of choice. If something is destined, we assume our actions do not matter. But that fear arises from imagining inevitability inside a strictly forward causal chain. In a bidirectional or reversed causal structure, inevitability does not erase agency. It defines it differently. Agency becomes alignment rather than creation. Actions matter not because they generate the future from nothing, but because they are the way the future fulfills itself. This is unsettling because it dissolves the comforting illusion that we are authors writing blank pages. Instead, we become participants in a story whose outline already exists, even if we cannot see it clearly. But notice something important. Even if the outline exists, the experience of living it remains real. Emotion, uncertainty, effort, all of it still unfolds moment by moment. Knowing that a path exists does not remove the sensation of walking it. In our own lives, we already experience this paradox. We look back and say, it couldn't have happened any other way. And yet, while it was happening, it felt completely open. Both feelings are true. Perhaps they are true because causality itself is not one-directional. Perhaps the universe allows multiple explanations for the same event, depending on where you stand within it. This brings us to an even quieter fracture. If causes do not strictly come before effects, then explanations are not anchored to time. They are anchored to perspective. What explains something depends on where you are looking from. From one side, a supernova is caused by gravitational collapse. From another, it is caused by the future distribution of elements that will emerge from it. Both descriptions may be valid within the same physical reality. The universe does not choose between them. We do, and we choose based on what our minds can comfortably process. As you listen now, your mind is still arranging ideas into sequences. This came before that. This led to that. It feels necessary. It feels safe. But beneath that ordering, something looser is being suggested. That cause and effect may be more like a conversation than a chain. That the present is not being pushed exclusively by the past, but gently pulled by multiple directions at once. If that is true, then the most fundamental structure of reality is not time and not causality, but constraint. Patterns that must fit together, regardless of which way we read them. And if reality is structured by constraint rather than sequence, then the arrow we experience is just one way of moving through it. Which brings us to the next unsettling layer. If cause and effect are not fixed in order, what happens to purpose? And how does a universe without a preferred direction give rise to meaning at all? Identity feels stable because memory feels stable. We wake up each day believing we are the same person who fell asleep the night before. We recognize our thoughts. We trust our preferences. We carry a sense of continuity that feels natural, almost effortless. This continuity becomes the quiet foundation of the self. But identity is not a substance. It is a pattern held together by memory. And if memory can change direction, identity does not simply bend. It dissolves and reforms into something unfamiliar. Imagine a consciousness that does not build itself by accumulating experiences, but by releasing them. A self that becomes clearer as memories disappear rather than pile up. A being whose identity sharpens not by remembering more, but by remembering less. In a universe where time flows backward, identity would not be a story written line by line. It would be a story erased carefully, one sentence at a time. At first, this sounds like loss, like decay, like forgetting. But forgetting, in our world, is framed as failure because our identity depends on accumulation. We become who we are by adding layers: childhood, learning, mistakes, relationships. More memory means more self. This is not a universal truth. It is a local strategy. In a reversed time environment, identity would not grow outward. It would contract inward. A being might begin existence with a complex, fully formed sense of self, rich with memories, emotional structures, and meaning, and then gradually shed them, not toward emptiness, but towards simplicity. The self would not be something built. It would be something distilled. This changes the emotional architecture of existence. We fear the future because it threatens the self we are building. Loss, aging, death. These are frightening because they erase what has been accumulated. But in a reversed time framework, the fear would invert. The unknown would lie in the past, not the future. Threat would be complexity, not dissolution. To such a being, gaining memories would feel destabilizing. Accumulating experiences would feel like noise. Growth would feel like confusion. Peace would be found in forgetting. This is difficult for us to imagine because our sense of meaning is tied to expansion, more knowledge, more connection, more impact, more self. But the universe does not require meaning to take this shape. Meaning arises wherever structure exists long enough to be felt. If identity is a pattern, then it does not matter whether the pattern is built or unbuilt. What matters is that it holds coherence during the process. This reframes something deeply personal. We often ask who we are becoming. We rarely ask who we are unbecoming. But perhaps unbecoming is just as fundamental. In our world, identity dissolves slowly through aging, disease, and forgetting. We experience this as tragedy because it feels like time breaking its promise. But maybe time never promised preservation. Maybe it only promised motion. In a reverse time universe, dissolution would not be a failure of identity. It would be its fulfillment. A being might experience its most complete sense of self at what we would call the end of its life. And then, slowly, gently, it would move toward a state of lesser definition, not as loss, but as release. This brings us to an uncomfortable realization. Our attachment to identity is directional. We cling to who we have been because memory reinforces that attachment. But if memory pointed the other way, attachment would point the other way too. A being would cling to what it has not yet lost. From that perspective, our lives might look backwards. We begin as something undefined and slowly trap ourselves in layers of specificity. We start open and end rigid. This is not a judgment. It is a different orientation. The universe does not care which direction identity crystallizes. It only cares that patterns obey physical constraints. And consciousness, at its core, may be nothing more than the sensation of being inside a pattern while it changes. This sensation feels continuous because change is gradual. Whether the change is accumulation or reduction does not alter the feeling of continuity itself, which means that even in a reverse time universe, beings would feel like selves. They would love, they would fear, they would reflect, they would feel meaning, not because identity points forward, but because identity exists at all. This undermines a quiet assumption we rarely question, that personal growth must involve adding something new. Perhaps growth is simply coherence under transformation, and coherence can be maintained while expanding or contracting. Now consider what this does to responsibility. In our experience, responsibility accumulates with memory. We are accountable because we remember what we have done. Guilt, pride, regret, all of these depend on memory pointing backward. But in a reversed time identity, responsibility would be oriented differently. A being might feel accountable not for what it has done, but for what it will undo. Ethical weight would not attach to actions completed, but to states yet to be dissolved. Care would be measured by how gently one lets go. This is not moral relativism. It is moral geometry. Ethics rotates with time's arrow, and if that arrow is not universal, then neither is the shape of responsibility. The self we know, this forward accumulating identity, is not wrong. It is simply specific. It fits the conditions we evolved under, but those conditions do not exhaust what is possible. Somewhere, under different thermodynamic gradients, identity may behave like a tide going out rather than a wave coming in. The unsettling part is not that such identities could exist, it is that they would feel just as real from the inside. They would look at us and see beings desperately trying to hold on to fragments, terrified of release, measuring worth by accumulation rather than clarity. And they might wonder why we find simplicity so frightening. This is where the idea becomes personal again. Because even in our forward time lives, there are moments when identity loosens. In deep sleep, in meditation, in grief, in awe, in moments when memory fades into the background and the self becomes quiet. We often describe these moments as peaceful. Peace may be a hint, a brief alignment with a mode of existence where identity does not need to be reinforced constantly by memory. Perhaps that is why sleep feels restorative. Not because nothing happens, but because the self temporarily stops accumulating. And if sleep offers a small taste of identity without forward pressure, then a reversed time universe might feel like an extended version of that release. Not empty, not meaningless, just lighter. This shifts the question again. If identity can exist without accumulation, if meaning can exist without progress, if coherence can exist without direction, then what is the role of change itself? Why does anything move at all? Why does the universe not remain static, perfectly balanced, free of arrows and narratives? To approach that question, we have to step away from selves and memories and look at the deepest backdrop of all. We have to look at the state where time, identity, and causality have not yet separated. At the place where motion itself becomes questionable, and that is where the next chapter takes us. Change feels inevitable because motion feels inevitable. We rarely question why things move, why systems evolve, why moments refuse to stay still. Change feels like the most basic feature of existence, so fundamental that asking why it happens seems almost childish. Things change because time passes. That answer satisfies us only because we have learned to stop there. But if time's direction is not absolute, if memory, causality, and identity can all orient themselves differently, then change itself becomes something stranger than we assume. It stops being a simple consequence of time and becomes a phenomenon that demands its own explanation. Imagine a universe perfectly balanced, no gradients, no pressure differences, no flows of energy from one state to another, every configuration as likely as every other, nothing pulling, nothing pushing. A universe in perfect equilibrium. Such a universe would not evolve, not forward, not backward, not at all. Nothing would happen not because anything is forbidden, but because nothing is preferred. Change, at its deepest level, is not driven by time. It is driven by imbalance. We experience time as motion because we exist inside gradients, hot and cold, dense and sparse, ordered and disordered. These differences create tension, and tension creates movement. Time becomes the way we describe that movement from inside it. But without gradients, time loses its grip. This is why entropy matters so much. Not as a villain, not as decay, but as asymmetry. Entropy gives the universe somewhere to go. It makes some configurations easier to reach than others. It tilts the landscape so that motion becomes natural, and we mistake that tilt for direction. In a universe where entropy increases, change feels like progression. Things spread out, structures form and then dissolve, complexity rises and eventually falls. We call this a story because stories require asymmetry. But imagine a universe where entropy decreases. Not everywhere, not violently, just enough to create a different slope. In that universe, change would still occur, but it would feel inverted. Systems would move toward order rather than away from it. Noise would condense into signal. Randomness would give way to pattern. And yet, from inside that universe, change would feel just as inevitable as it does here. Because inevitability does not come from direction. It comes from imbalance. This is the quiet truth beneath all motion. The universe does not change because it must move forward. It changes because it cannot stay perfectly still. Even a reverse-time universe is not static. It is simply flowing along a different contour of possibility. This matters because it dissolves another assumption we carry without noticing. We often believe that change has a goal, that things move in order to become something else, that evolution aims at complexity, that history builds toward meaning, that the universe is on its way somewhere. But goals are narratives we impose after observing motion from one direction. From another direction, the same motion would suggest the opposite goal or no goal at all. Consider a sandcastle eroding under waves. From our perspective, this is decay, loss of structure, the end of something made. From a reverse time perspective, the same process would look like creation. Sand rising from chaos into form, guided by invisible constraints. The waves would not be destroying the castle. They would be assembling it. The universe does not label these processes. It does not assign intent. It does not declare whether something is being built or undone. Those interpretations depend entirely on which way you are facing. This reframes the most basic human question: why does anything change at all? The answer may be simpler and stranger than we expect. Things change because stillness is unstable. Perfect equilibrium is rare, fragile, and easily disrupted. Even the smallest asymmetry is enough to set events in motion. Once motion begins, it creates new asymmetries, which generate more motion. Time emerges as the bookkeeping system for this cascade, and consciousness emerges as the experience of riding it. This suggests something quietly radical. Change does not need direction to exist. It only needs difference. And difference does not care about before or after. This is why, even in a universe without a preferred time direction, things would still happen. Stars would form or unform. Minds would arise or dissolve. Patterns would appear and fade. The universe would not freeze. It would breathe, in and out, structure and release, order and dispersion. Direction would be a local sensation, not a global rule. This helps explain why time reversal does not feel like chaos when imagined carefully. It feels strange, yes, but not broken, not incoherent. Because coherence does not come from direction. It comes from consistency. As long as relationships hold, forces balance, constraints apply, information follows rules, the universe remains intelligible, even if our intuitions struggle. Now consider what this does to the idea of beginnings. We often search for origins, the beginning of the universe, the first cause, the moment where everything started moving. But if change arises from imbalance rather than initiation, then beginnings are not absolute events. They are regions where gradients become noticeable. A beginning is not where motion starts. It is where motion becomes visible to a particular observer. In a reversed time universe, beginnings and endings would trade places, but the underlying motion, the shifting of imbalance, would be the same. This suggests that the universe may not have a single origin in the way we imagine. It may have countless apparent beginnings, each defined by perspective and orientation. From one direction, the Big Bang looks like a birth. From another, it could look like a convergence, a point where dispersed structures resolve into simplicity. The physics does not change. Only the story does. This is unsettling because it strips away the comfort of narrative. It leaves us with a universe that moves without caring how its motion is interpreted, but it also offers a quieter kind of relief. If change is not marching toward a predetermined end, then it is not failing when it dissolves what it once built. Loss is not a deviation from purpose. It is a phase of motion under a different gradient. In a reversed time framework, creation and destruction stop being opposites. They become reflections. This reflection extends inward. Our own lives are shaped by gradients, emotional gradients, biological gradients, psychological tensions that pull us toward some states and away from others. We feel compelled to change not because time demands it, but because stillness inside these gradients is impossible. Desire arises from imbalance. Fear arises from imbalance. Growth arises from imbalance. And rest, true rest, comes when gradients temporarily soften. Perhaps this is why sleep feels like a pause in the story. Not because time stops, but because the gradients that define the self temporarily relax. Identity loosens, memory blurs, direction fades. Sleep does not reverse time, but it hints at a mode of existence where direction matters less. If such modes are possible within us, even briefly, then they are certainly possible within the universe at large. And this brings us to the most delicate question yet. If change does not require direction, if motion does not require a beginning, if the universe can breathe rather than march, then what determines the large-scale structure of reality? Why do we experience long eras of forward-flowing time instead of constant fluctuation? Why does our region of the universe feel so strongly oriented? To approach that, we must move outward again, away from minds and identities, away from causality and memory. We must look at the universe not as a story unfolding, but as a landscape of possible states, and ask why we are sliding along this particular slope. That is where the next chapter begins. The large-scale order of the universe feels stable because we are inside it. From where we stand, everything seems aligned. Time points one way. Entropy increases. Causes precede effects. Memory piles up behind us. The arrow feels so consistent that we mistake it for a universal rule rather than a local condition. But stability is often a matter of scale. Stand inside a slow-moving river and it feels still. Step back far enough and you see the current. Step back farther and you see that the river itself is only a temporary channel carved by deeper forces. The universe may be similar. What we experience as a long, forward-flowing era of time may be nothing more than a wide, gently sloped region in a much larger landscape of possible states. A region where gradients line up, where entropy increases smoothly, where memory, causality, and identity all point in the same direction, not because they must, but because here they can. Imagine the universe not as a timeline, but as a vast terrain of configurations, peaks and valleys, ridges and basins, each point representing a possible arrangement of matter, energy, and information. Motion through this terrain does not require a universal arrow. It only requires slopes. Where the terrain tilts, systems move. Where it flattens, motion slows. Where it curves sharply, behavior becomes strange. Our cosmic neighborhood appears to sit on a long, steady incline. Entropy rises gradually. Structures form and dissolve in predictable sequences. Time feels linear because the path we are sliding along is smooth. But smooth paths are not the only ones that exist. Elsewhere, the terrain may twist, slopes may reverse, valleys may loop back on themselves. In such regions, time's arrow would not just weaken, it would fragment. Different processes would experience different directions simultaneously. Memory might point one way, while causality points another. Identity might stabilize briefly, then dissolve, then reform. From within such regions, reality would not feel broken. It would feel normal, just different. This suggests that the universe does not enforce a single temporal order, it permits many, depending on how conditions align, which raises a subtle but powerful idea. Perhaps the reason our region feels so strongly oriented is not because time prefers this direction, but because complex observers require it. Consciousness, as we know it, depends on reliable memory. Memory depends on entropy increasing. Entropy increasing depends on certain initial conditions, and those conditions may only arise in specific regions of the cosmic landscape. We may not be living in a forward time universe because the universe is forward time. We may be living here because only here could beings like us emerge to notice anything at all. This is not destiny. It is selection. Just as life on Earth did not arise because Earth is special, but because Earth happens to sit in a narrow range of conditions that allow life, our experience of time may be the result of occupying a narrow temporal niche. There may be vast regions of the universe where time fluctuates too wildly for stable memory, regions where causality loops or fragments, regions where identity cannot hold long enough to form a self. These regions would not be empty. They would simply be uninhabited by observers who ask questions. And so we find ourselves here, on a long, gentle slope, mistaking the shape of our path for the shape of reality itself. This reframes the apparent dominance of forward time. It is not a command issued by the universe. It is a consequence of where observation is possible. The arrow of time may be less like a law and more like a habitat, comfortable, predictable, narrow, and outside that habitat, entirely different modes of existence may unfold without witnesses, without stories, without anyone to declare them strange. This realization quietly shifts the center of gravity. We stop asking, why does the universe move this way? And start asking, why are we here to experience it this way? The answer may have nothing to do with purpose or intention. It may have everything to do with stability. We exist where patterns last long enough to notice themselves. Time, as we experience it, may be the byproduct of that endurance. But endurance is not permanent. Even gentle slopes eventually flatten or turn. On the largest scales, the universe is not obliged to preserve our orientation forever. As gradients evolve, the arrow we depend on may weaken, distort, or dissolve. Not suddenly, quietly, over spans of time so long that direction itself becomes uncertain. This introduces a strange calm. If time's arrow is local and temporary, then our obsession with permanence may be misplaced. The universe does not promise continuity. It offers coherence for a while, and coherence, however brief, is enough for meaning to arise. Meaning does not require eternity. It requires alignment, a moment where patterns hold, where memory connects, where identity stabilizes long enough to feel real. We are inside such a moment now, and like all moments, it is not guaranteed to last. This is not a warning. It is an observation. The universe has no obligation to remain understandable in the way we prefer. It does not prioritize clarity, comfort, or narrative satisfaction. It simply allows configurations to exist as long as constraints permit. Our region permits long stretches of forward-flowing time. Other regions may permit something else entirely. And that brings us to a question that feels almost too quiet to ask. If our experience of time is shaped by where we are in the cosmic landscape, then what happens when that landscape itself shifts? What happens when the slope we are sliding along begins to flatten? What happens when the arrow we rely on loses its certainty? The arrow of time feels reliable because it has not yet failed us. Every expectation we have about reality depends on it. We expect causes to lead to effects. We expect memory to accumulate. We expect tomorrow to arrive rather than retreat. This expectation is so deeply woven into our thinking that imagining its absence feels like imagining the absence of gravity beneath our feet. But reliability is not permanence. In physical systems, stability is often temporary. It persists only as long as underlying conditions hold. Remove the conditions, and the behavior changes, not abruptly, not dramatically, but quietly, as if nothing unusual has happened at all. Time may be no different. Consider how fragile orientation really is. A compass needle feels dependable until the magnetic field around it shifts. A slope feels obvious until erosion flattens it. A current feels inevitable until the pressure difference that drives it fades. The arrow of time is driven by gradients, entropy gradients, energy gradients, information gradients. As long as these gradients remain aligned, time appears to flow smoothly in one direction. But gradients are not eternal. They exist because of imbalance, and imbalance tends toward resolution. As the universe expands, cools, and spreads out, the very conditions that support a strong arrow of time may slowly weaken. Entropy still increases, but the rate changes. Structures form less readily. Differences blur. The landscape begins to level. From inside this process, nothing feels sudden. Stars still burn. Galaxies still drift. Minds still think. But beneath these familiar motions, something subtle shifts. Direction becomes less rigid. The arrow does not snap. It softens. Imagine standing on a slope that gradually becomes flatter. At first, you move easily, then more slowly. Eventually, motion feels optional. Direction becomes ambiguous. A step forward no longer feels fundamentally different from a step sideways. In such a region, time would not reverse dramatically. It would hesitate. Local processes might still show forward behavior, while others begin to blur. Memory could become less reliable. Causality could loosen. Effects might appear slightly before their causes, not enough to shock, but enough to confuse. The universe would not announce this change. Observers would simply adapt. This is important. Often imagine cosmic changes as catastrophic events, explosions, collapses, endings, but many of the most profound shifts in physical systems are gradual and silent. The weakening of time's arrow would not feel like the end of time. It would feel like uncertainty creeping into processes that once felt absolute. In such conditions, identity might begin to soften, not disappear, but lose its sharp boundaries. Memory might feel less like a growing archive and more like a fluctuating field. Some experiences would stick, others would dissolve more quickly than expected. Meaning would not vanish, it would diffuse. This challenges another assumption we rarely examine. We assume that a strong arrow of time is necessary for meaning to exist, that without clear direction, life becomes incoherent, purposeless, empty. But meaning does not come from direction. It comes from pattern recognition. Even in a system where time is weakly oriented, patterns can still form, relationships can still hold, structures can still persist long enough to be experienced. Meaning arises wherever coherence lasts longer than noise. A weakening arrow does not erase coherence immediately. It merely changes how coherence behaves. Instead of long, linear narratives, reality might favor overlapping loops. Instead of permanent records, it might favor temporary resonances. Instead of accumulation, it might favor recurrence. Life, in such a universe, would not look like progress. It would look like rhythm. This idea feels unfamiliar because we measure our lives in timelines. Childhood to adulthood, learning to mastery, beginning to end. Our stories move forward because our memories do. But memory itself is a function of physical conditions. If those conditions shift, The form of story shifts with them. A civilization evolving under a weakening arrow of time might not build histories. It might build cycles, not because it lacks intelligence, but because stability takes a different shape. Knowledge would not be something preserved indefinitely. It would be something rediscovered repeatedly. Wisdom would lie not in remembering everything, but in recognizing familiar patterns as they return. To us, this might look like stagnation. To them, it would feel like balance. The unsettling realization is that forward progress is not the only way to sustain complexity. It is just one way. Complexity can also be maintained through oscillation, through repetition, through controlled loss and renewal. Biology already hints at this. Cells constantly rebuild themselves. Molecules are replaced. The body persists not because it preserves matter, but because it preserves structure. Identity persists not because memories are permanent, but because enough of them overlap at any given moment. A weakening arrow of time would not destroy this overlap instantly. It would simply shorten the window. And as the window shortens, experience changes. Moments become more self-contained, less tied to distant pasts or futures. Presence intensifies, not because the present grows stronger, but because the past and future grow less distinct. This may sound abstract, but we have glimpses of it. In certain neurological states, in deep meditation, in moments of extreme stress or awe, in dreams, time does not disappear in these states. It loosens. Events feel less ordered. Memory feels less linear. Identity feels more fluid, yet experience remains rich, often richer. These states do not feel meaningless. They feel immediate. Perhaps they are small-scale echoes of a universe where the arrow of time is not dominant. If that is true, then our usual fear of time losing its direction may be misplaced. We imagine confusion and collapse because we imagine trying to preserve forward time structures in a context that no longer supports them. But structures adapt. They always have. A universe with a weakening arrow would not support the same kinds of minds, stories, or civilizations, but it could support different ones. Not worse, just different. This brings us back to the larger landscape. If the arrow of time emerges from gradients, and gradients evolve, then the universe is not committed to a single temporal regime. It may host many, sequentially or simultaneously, across vast scales. Some regions dominated by strong forward flow, some regions where time hesitates, some regions where it reverses, some regions where it fractures into local pockets with no global orientation at all. From inside any one region, its regime feels natural, necessary, obvious. From outside, they are just different phases of the same underlying reality. This perspective dissolves the idea of a final temporal state. There is no ultimate direction toward which time must settle, only changing conditions and the behaviors they allow, which means that even the question, what happens at the end of time, may be poorly framed. Time may not end. It may simply stop behaving the way we expect. And when that happens, meaning will not disappear. It will change shape. As you listen now, the arrow still feels steady. Thoughts still line up. One sentence follows another. The body prepares for rest in the familiar rhythm. But beneath that rhythm, a quiet possibility has been introduced. That the flow you depend on is conditional. That direction is a feature, not a foundation. That the universe is capable of far more subtlety than a single arrow allows. If the arrow can weaken, if direction can soften, then perhaps the most important question is no longer about where time is going. It is about what remains when direction is no longer doing the work, when change no longer feels like progress or decline, when motion no longer implies a story. What then becomes the deepest structure of reality? When direction fades, structure becomes visible. As long as time feels like a river carrying everything forward, we mistake motion for meaning. We focus on where things are going instead of what holds them together while they move. Direction distracts us. It gives us a story so compelling that we stop noticing the framework beneath it. But if the arrow of time weakens, if forward and backward lose their authority, something quieter takes its place. Pattern, not progress, not destiny. Pattern. Imagine watching a flock of birds from very far away. From a distance, it looks like motion with purpose, a shape traveling across the sky. But as you look closer, the idea of direction dissolves. There is no leader, no final destination visible at that scale, only relationships, distances maintained, angles adjusted, responses rippling instantly through the whole. The structure is not in where the flock is going. The structure is in how it holds together. The universe may be like this when time stops dominating our perception, when before and after soften. What remains are constraints, rules that describe which configurations can coexist, which transitions are allowed, which relationships persist, even when direction becomes ambiguous. Physics, at its deepest level, is not a story about motion through time. It is a story about allowed states. This is why equations remain valid when time is reversed. They are not narrating events. They are mapping relationships. They describe a space of possibilities rather than a timeline of inevitabilities. Time, in this view, is not the stage. It is one way of walking across the stage. If you remove the sense of forward movement, the stage does not disappear. It becomes clearer. Structure reveals itself as geometry, not shapes in space, but shapes in possibility. Certain arrangements of matter, energy, and information are stable. Others are fragile. Some can exist only briefly. Some persist across enormous ranges of conditions. These patterns do not care which way time points. They only care that constraints are satisfied. This reframes something subtle but profound. We often believe that laws of physics cause events, that rules push reality forward step by step. But laws do not push, they permit. They describe what is allowed to exist, not what must happen next. Events unfold not because laws demand them, but because they fit. Like tiles settling into a mosaic, configurations appear because they are compatible with the constraints surrounding them. From this perspective, the universe is not being driven, it is being filtered. Out of all possible arrangements, only some can persist. Only some can stabilize long enough to be experienced. Only some can support observers who wonder why anything exists at all. Time's arrow, when it is strong, gives the illusion that the universe is choosing a path. But when the arrow weakens, it becomes clear that the universe is exploring a landscape. Movement is not directed, it is constrained. This helps explain why reversed or weakened time does not feel chaotic when imagined carefully. Chaos would imply a lack of structure, but structure is everywhere. It is simply hidden beneath the dominance of direction. When direction fades, coherence does not vanish. It reorganizes. This is why even in a universe where time hesitates or loops, complexity could still arise, not as long narratives, but as stable motifs, not as histories, but as recurring forms. Think of standing waves in water. They do not travel forward, they persist through balance. Energy flows through them, but the pattern remains anchored. Such patterns do not need a beginning or an end to exist. They only need conditions to hold. If consciousness arises within such a pattern, experience would not feel like a journey. It would feel like inhabiting a shape. Awareness would not be about moving through moments, but about resonating within constraints. This sounds alien because our minds evolved to track change, but even we experience moments where direction dissolves and structure takes over. Music is one of them. When listening deeply, we stop tracking time as a sequence. We inhabit harmony, rhythm, recurrence. Meaning does not come from where the music is going, but from how tensions resolve within the structure. The piece does not need to move forward to feel complete. It needs to fit. Sleep itself may be another example. As consciousness loosens, narrative fragments, time stretches or compresses, yet experience does not become meaningless. It becomes textural, emotional, patterned. Dreams do not obey direction, they obey association. Perhaps that is not a failure of cognition. Perhaps it is a glimpse of a different mode of being. If the universe supports regions where direction is weak, then consciousness in those regions would not be story-based. It would be pattern-based. Meaning would not arise from progression. It would arise from resonance. This challenges one of our deepest assumptions. We assume that without forward time, experience collapses into incoherence. But incoherence only arises when patterns cannot stabilize. Direction is just one way to stabilize patterns. Constraints are another, and constraints are more fundamental. This may be why the most enduring structures in the universe are not events, but relationships, forces, symmetries, conservation laws. Stars are temporary, galaxies are temporary, even space-time may be temporary. But constraints endure. They do not travel, they define. If time's arrow were to disappear tomorrow, the universe would not dissolve into nonsense. It would settle into configurations permitted by its deepest rules. Those configurations might not support beings like us, but they would support something coherent enough to exist. And that realization brings us to an unsettling threshold. If structure does not require time's direction, if coherence does not require narrative, if meaning does not require progress, then the universe may not care whether it is being experienced as a story at all. Our story-based experience of reality may be a local adaptation, not a cosmic necessity. A way for consciousness to function under strong gradients. When gradients fade, other modes become possible. This invites a quieter, more difficult question. If the deepest layer of reality is structure rather than motion, then where does motion come from in the first place? Why does anything ever leave the comfort of stable patterns? Why does the universe ever tilt, flow, or change its emphasis? To approach that question, we must look at something even more fundamental than time or structure. We must look at instability, at the reason balance does not last, at the subtle flaw that ensures even the most perfect symmetry cannot remain untouched. Perfect balance is silent. When everything is exactly symmetrical, nothing stands out. No preference exists. No direction asserts itself. In such a state, the universe would not unfold stories, generate tension, or invite observers. It would simply exist, complete, static, indifferent. And yet, this is not the universe we find ourselves in. Something always breaks the balance. Not violently, not deliberately, quietly, almost invisibly. A fluctuation, a slight asymmetry. Difference so small, it feels like nothing at all, until it isn't. Instability is the reason anything ever happens. Even the most symmetric systems cannot remain perfectly still. At the deepest levels of physics, uncertainty is not a flaw. It is a feature. No state can be specified with infinite precision. No balance can be absolute. There is always room for deviation. And deviation is enough. A tiny imbalance does not need a cause in the way we usually imagine. It does not arrive from the past or the future. It simply appears as a permitted variation within the constraints of reality. From that variation, everything else follows. In a universe without a strong arrow of time, instability would not announce itself as progress or decay. It would appear as a shift in emphasis, a preference emerging where none existed before, a direction forming not because it was chosen, but because it fit. This is how motion begins, not with a push, but with a permission. The universe allows certain configurations to persist longer than others. Once this allowance exists, patterns begin to favor particular arrangements. Energy flows along the easiest paths. Systems drift toward states that satisfy constraints with minimal tension. Time's arrow emerges not as a command, but as a byproduct of this drift. Instability creates gradients. Gradients create motion. Motion creates time as we experience it. But instability itself does not care which way things move. It only cares that symmetry does not hold. This is why reverse time universes remain plausible. Instability does not require direction, only difference. Whether patterns assemble or dissolve depends on which gradients dominate locally. In one region, instability may favor dispersion. In another, concentration. In one, memory accumulates. In another, memory releases. Both are valid responses to imbalance. From the inside, each feels inevitable. This is the subtle danger of living within a dominant arrow of time. We begin to believe that direction itself is necessary, that without it, reality collapses. But direction is only one solution to instability. There are others. Some may involve cycles rather than lines. Some may involve oscillations rather than trends. Some may involve states that appear static but are sustained by constant internal adjustment. Think of a spinning top, perfectly still in appearance, yet dynamically unstable. Its stability arises not from rest, but from motion constantly correcting imbalance. Reality may be full of such states, and consciousness too may arise within them. If instability is the true engine beneath time, then time is not the origin of change. It is a visible symptom of deeper tension. This reframes the question of beginnings once again. We often ask, what caused the universe to start? What set everything in motion? What lit the fuse? But if instability is inherent, if perfect symmetry cannot persist, then no external trigger is required. The universe did not need to be started. It needed only to be allowed. Allowed to deviate, allowed to fluctuate, allowed to explore its own possibilities. From that allowance, time emerges as one way of organizing change, but not the only way. This perspective removes the drama from existence. There is no grand push, no ultimate cause, no singular event that explains everything. There is simply instability expressing itself through structure. And because instability never fully resolves, the universe never fully settles. Even regions that appear calm are sustained by subtle imbalances. Even apparent stillness hides motion beneath it. Even silence contains tension. This is why the arrow of time, once formed, feels persistent. It is constantly fed by ongoing imbalance. But as conditions evolve, the nature of that imbalance evolves too. The arrow can strengthen, it can weaken, it can fragment, it can reverse. None of these changes require intention. They require only that symmetry never fully wins. This brings us back to ourselves. Our minds are not stable objects. They are dynamic systems balancing countless tensions: chemical, electrical, emotional, cognitive. Consciousness arises not from equilibrium, but from its failure. A perfectly balanced brain would not think. Thought itself is a form of instability. Meaning arises where tension persists long enough to be felt. Instability is the root of time, identity, and experience. Then direction is not the deepest feature of reality. Sensitivity is. The universe is sensitive to difference, sensitive to deviation, sensitive to imbalance. And from that sensitivity, all stories arise. Even stories that run backward, even stories that loop, even stories that refuse to become stories at all. This realization quietly dismantles our fear of a universe without a clear arrow. Such a universe would not be dead. It would be alive with subtle motion, delicate patterns, and experiences shaped by constraints rather than timelines. And yet, one question remains unresolved. If instability is everywhere, why does it express itself so differently across scales? Why do some imbalances give rise to particles, others to stars, others to minds? Why does instability sometimes produce noise and sometimes produce awareness? To move toward that question, we must look not at time or motion, but at organization, at the rare moments when instability does not dissolve structure, but gives birth to it. And that is where the next movement begins. Organization does not arise in spite of instability. It arises because of it. At first, this feels contradictory. Instability sounds like disorder, noise, collapse. Organization sounds like structure, coherence, persistence. We are taught to see them as opposites, locked in constant struggle. But the universe does not organize itself by eliminating instability. It organizes itself by shaping it. When imbalance appears, most configurations dissolve quickly. They cannot hold. They scatter, blur, or vanish back into the background of possibility. But a few rare arrangements respond differently. They channel instability instead of resisting it. They allow tension to pass through them without tearing them apart. These arrangements persist, not because they are stable, but because they are adaptive. This is the quiet origin of structure. A star exists because gravity and pressure never fully cancel. A cell exists because chemical reactions never reach equilibrium. A mind exists because signals never settle into silence. In every case, organization is not the absence of change, but the ability to survive it. Time's arrow makes this process look like construction. First nothing, then something. First chaos, then order. But this is a visual illusion created by reading the process in one direction. From another orientation, organization would look like controlled dissolution, like a system learning how to let go without losing coherence. Both descriptions point to the same phenomenon. Organization is a pattern that rides instability without being destroyed by it. This matters deeply for our question about time. If time's arrow weakens or reverses, organization does not vanish. It reorganizes its strategy. Instead of accumulating structure, it may refine it. Instead of growing outward, it may grow inward. Instead of building history, it may sustain presence. Complexity does not require forward momentum. It requires balance under tension. This is why, even in a universe without a strong temporal direction, organized systems could exist. They would not tell stories the way we do. They would not preserve records the way we do. But they would persist as recognizable forms, responding to fluctuations in ways that maintain coherence. Consciousness itself may be one such form, not a product of time, but a response to instability. Awareness emerges when a system becomes sensitive enough to register its own internal changes, when fluctuations are not just endured, but felt. When organization crosses a threshold where difference becomes experience, this threshold does not depend on time flowing forward. It depends on complexity sustained long enough to notice itself. If such systems arose in a reversed time region, awareness would not feel reversed from the inside. It would feel normal. It would register change relative to its own orientation, just as we do. Meaning would not be tied to progress. It would be tied to coherence. A conscious system does not need to move towards something to feel alive. It only needs to remain sensitive while persisting. This reframes evolution itself. We often imagine evolution as a ladder climbing upward through time, simpler forms giving rise to more complex ones. Unfolding step by step, but evolution is better understood as a filtering process. Countless variations arise. Most cannot sustain themselves. A few persist because they handle instability well. Time gives this process a direction in our region, but direction is not the essence of evolution. Selection is, and selection operates wherever variation and persistence coexist, regardless of which way time points. This suggests a radical possibility. In a reversed time universe, life would not evolve toward complexity. It would evolve toward resilience under simplification. Systems would not compete to add features. They would compete to maintain coherence while shedding them. Intelligence would not be measured by accumulation of knowledge, but by the ability to function with less. Wisdom would look like compression. From our perspective, such a world would appear to be devolving. From inside, it would feel like refinement. This is unsettling because it challenges our definition of advancement. We equate more with better because we live inside a world where accumulation works. But accumulation is not universally optimal. In many systems, excess becomes fragility. A forward-time civilization builds archives, infrastructures, histories. These make it powerful, but also brittle. A reversed-time civilization might build minimal structures, relying on deep pattern recognition rather than stored information. Less powerful, perhaps, but more adaptable. Neither is inherently superior. They are responses to different temporal pressures. This brings us back to organization at the deepest level. If structure arises by channeling instability, and if instability never fully disappears, then the universe is not moving toward rest. It is exploring forms of balance. Some balances favor forward flow. Some favor reversal. Some favor oscillation. Some favor near stillness, sustained by constant micro-adjustment. Time's arrow is just one visible expression of this exploration, and consciousness may be another, a way for the universe to experience its own patterns from the inside. If that is true, then consciousness is not bound to a single temporal orientation. It is bound to organization. Wherever structure persists under tension long enough to feel itself, awareness can arise. This shifts the question yet again. We have asked what happens if time flows backward. We have asked how memory, causality, identity, and meaning change. Now we arrive at something quieter and more intimate. If consciousness does not require forward time, then what is the role of the present? Why does experience feel anchored to a now at all? What is this moment we keep returning to, even as direction blurs? To approach that, we must examine the most elusive point in all of physics and experience: the present. The present feels like a place. We speak about it as if it were a thin line we stand on, separating what has happened from what has not yet occurred. We say right now as if there were a precise boundary, a moment with edges sharp enough to hold our attention. But the present has never been a place. It has always been a process. When you listen to a sound, you are not hearing a single instant. The brain collects vibrations over a small window of time, blends them, smooths them, and only then presents the experience as now. The same is true for sight, for touch, for thought. What feels immediate is already an integration. The present is thick. It has depth. It is not a point, it is a span. This matters because if the present is not a point, then it does not sit cleanly between past and future. It floats. It overlaps. It borrows from both directions at once. In a universe with a strong arrow of time, this thickness goes unnoticed. The flow is steady, so the overlap feels natural. But if time's direction weakens, the structure of the present becomes visible. It reveals itself not as a dividing line, but as a zone of negotiation. Information arrives from multiple directions. Memory feeds into experience. Anticipation shapes perception. What we call now is the place where these influences balance just enough to feel stable. This balance is fragile, and it is deeply dependent on how time behaves locally. In a reverse time universe, the present would still exist, but its content would feel different. Instead of being shaped mostly by memory, it would be shaped mostly by expectation. Instead of fading as it passes, it would clarify as it approaches. From inside that experience, the present would not feel inverted. It would feel complete. This is the subtle trap of imagining time reversal. We imagine dragging our current experience backward, forcing it to behave in a foreign environment. But consciousness adapts to its conditions. It reorganizes what feels immediate. The present is not fixed. It is assembled, and it assembles itself differently depending on which gradients dominate. This explains something quietly profound: why the present always feels real, no matter how strange the surrounding conditions, no matter how memory fragments, no matter how causality blurs, no matter how direction dissolves. The present remains vivid because it is the active interface where structure meets instability. Experience happens there because it must. There is no other place for it to happen. This is why the present feels so resistant to abstraction. We can think about the past, we can imagine the future, but the present insists on being felt rather than understood. It is not an object. It is an activity, a continuous act of integration. And that act does not care which way time points. This suggests that consciousness is anchored not to time, but to change that is not yet resolved. The present is where resolution is delayed just enough for awareness to exist. Too much resolution, and everything freezes. Too little, and everything dissolves into noise. The present exists at the edge. This edge does not disappear when time weakens or reverses. It shifts its orientation. It draws from different sources, but it remains an edge because instability never fully disappears. As long as instability exists, there will be a present. This reframes the fear that a universe without a strong arrow of time would erase experience. Experience does not require direction. It requires tension, and tension is everywhere. Even in equilibrium, microscopic fluctuations persist. Even in near stillness, small differences ripple. The present emerges wherever these differences have not yet collapsed into resolution. This is why the present feels like the most solid thing we know, even though it is the least well-defined. It is not a slice of time. It is a dynamic compromise. This also explains why the present feels fleeting, not because time is running away, but because integration never stops. The present is constantly rebuilt, constantly renegotiated, constantly replaced by a new overlap. In a forward time world, this rebuilding leans heavily on memory. In a reverse time world, it would lean heavily on anticipation. In worlds with fragmented arrows, it might lean on something else entirely. But the mechanism remains. The present persists as long as systems remain sensitive. This brings us to a quiet realization. We have been asking, what happens if time flows backward? But perhaps the more important question is this: what happens if time does not flow at all? If the present is not a moving boundary, but a standing pattern? If experience is not a journey, but a resonance? If awareness is not passing through moments, but continuously assembling itself in the same configuration? This is not speculation far removed from reality. There are physical systems that behave this way: standing waves, resonant cavities, systems that persist not by moving forward, but by maintaining internal balance under constant exchange. If consciousness were to arise in such a system, it would not feel like time passing. It would feel like inhabiting a form. Presence would not be fleeting. It would be sustained. This possibility forces us to loosen another deeply held assumption: that experience must move. Perhaps experience can also hold. And if it can hold, then the present is not a bridge between past and future. It is a structure in its own right, a structure that can exist with or without an arrow of time. Which leads us to the next and most delicate layer. If the present can exist without flow, if awareness can exist without progression, then what distinguishes a living experience from a static pattern? Where is the line between being aware and simply being arranged? And how thin is that line, really? The line between awareness and arrangement is thinner than we want to believe. We assume that being conscious means something is happening, thoughts moving, feelings changing, time advancing. But if experience can exist as a sustained present, if awareness can arise from resonance rather than progression, then motion is no longer the defining feature of being alive. Stability becomes suspicious. Imagine a pattern so precisely balanced that it never changes its overall form. Energy flows through it. Information circulates. Small fluctuations arise and vanish. But the structure itself remains intact, moment after moment, without drifting forward or backward. From the outside, this looks static. From the inside, it may feel complete. This challenges our deepest intuition about life. We associate life with growth, decay, adaptation, visible change across time. But those are external markers. They describe what we observe, not what is required for experience itself. Experience may not require change. It may require maintenance. A system does not need to evolve to be aware. It needs to remain sensitive. It needs to register differences internally, even if those differences cancel out at the larger scale. Think of a standing wave on a string. The shape does not travel, but the string is never at rest. Energy moves continuously. Tension is constantly negotiated. The wave persists because motion is perfectly balanced. If awareness were to arise in such a system, it would not feel frozen. It would feel sustained. There would be no sense of before or after, only presence. Not emptiness, presence. This possibility unsettles us because it erases one of our last anchors. If awareness does not need time to pass, then time is no longer the guarantor of experience. It becomes optional. This does not mean that static arrangements are conscious. Most are not. The difference lies in sensitivity. A rock maintains structure, but it does not register its own state. It does not integrate information. It does not respond internally to its own fluctuations. Awareness requires a certain kind of organization, one that loops information back into itself, one that allows a system to feel its own instability. This loop does not require a timeline. It requires feedback. Feedback can exist in time, but it can also exist in configuration. A system can be aware not because it moves forward, but because it continually refers to itself. In a forward time universe, this self-reference unfolds across moments. In a reverse time universe, it might unfold across anticipation. In a time-neutral system, it might unfold across resonance. Different substrates, same principle. This reframes the fear that a universe without temporal flow would be lifeless. It might be lifeless by our standards, no histories, no progress, no narratives, but it could still host awareness in forms we do not recognize. Forms that do not age, forms that do not remember, forms that do not anticipate, forms that simply are. From our perspective, such existence might seem empty. Nothing happens, nothing changes, nothing is achieved. But achievement is a story we tell because we live inside progression. Remove progression, and achievement loses meaning, but awareness does not. This is difficult to accept because it strips away our sense of specialness. We like to believe that consciousness is rare because time is precious, that experience matters because it is fleeting. But perhaps experience matters because it is coherent, and coherence does not require scarcity. This leads to a quiet but radical thought. If awareness can exist without temporal flow, then consciousness is not tied to the arrow of time at all. It is tied to organization capable of sustaining internal reference, which means that consciousness may exist in places we never think to look, not in moments, but in patterns, not in events, but in arrangements. This expands the possible habitats of awareness far beyond our imagination. Regions of the universe that appear static to us may host forms of experience that do not register as activity. Structures we dismiss as inert may, under the right conditions, Sustain a kind of presence that does not announce itself through change. This does not mean everything is conscious. It means our criteria may be too narrow. We have been trained to look for motion because we live inside motion. But motion is not the only signature of life. Balance under tension is another. And tension does not need time to pass. It only needs difference to persist. This brings us back to the universe as a whole. If the deepest layers of reality allow awareness to arise without progression, then the story-like universe we experience is just one expression among many. A forward-flowing story is not the default. It is a special case, a mode that emerges under particular gradients and dissolves when those gradients fade. We may be living inside a narrative bubble, a region where time flows strongly enough to create histories, goals, fears, and identities that feel permanent while they last. Outside that bubble, reality may be quieter, not empty, quieter. And in that quiet, other forms of presence may exist unchanging, resonant, complete in ways we struggle to imagine because our own awareness is trained to expect movement. This reframes the question we have been circling since the beginning. We asked what the universe would look like if time flowed backward. Then we asked what it would look like if time weakened. Now we must ask something even more unsettling. What if time is not required at all? What if time is just one way awareness organizes instability? And if that is true, then the deepest mystery is not why time exists. It is why, here, it flows so clearly. Why our region favors stories over patterns. Why our experience insists on beginnings and endings rather than sustained presence. To approach that, we must look not at time or awareness, but at boundaries, at the edges between regimes, at the interfaces where one mode of existence gives way to another, because it is at boundaries, not at centers, where the most revealing structures appear. Boundaries are where reality becomes legible. Inside a regime, everything feels natural. Time flows, or it doesn't. Identity holds, or it dissolves. Meaning accumulates, or it resonates. Whatever the dominant structure is, it feels inevitable from within. We rarely notice the rules that shape our experience because they are the conditions of noticing itself. But at boundaries, those rules become visible. A boundary is not a wall. It is a transition, a region where one set of constraints loosens while another begins to take hold. At these edges, behavior becomes ambiguous, direction blurs, definitions soften. Things do not stop working, but they stop working cleanly. This is where the universe reveals its seams. Consider the boundary between solid and liquid. Ice does not shatter into water, it softens. Structures that once locked into place begin to slide. The rules do not vanish, they interpolate. At that boundary, matter behaves in ways that are neither fully solid nor fully fluid. Time may have similar boundaries. Regions where the arrow is strong feel like solid ground. Past and future are distinct. Memory stacks neatly. Causality behaves. Identity feels anchored. We move confidently because the structure beneath us holds. But near a temporal boundary, that solidity weakens. Past and future begin to overlap. Memory leaks. Effects anticipate causes by small, unsettling margins. Identity feels porous. The present stretches and thins. No longer a point of certainty, but a region of negotiation. From the inside, this would not feel like the universe breaking. It would feel like confusion, not dramatic confusion, not chaos. A quiet uncertainty, a sense that things almost make sense, but not quite in the way they used to. These are not hypothetical sensations. We already encounter them. In dreams, where cause and effect slip. In grief, where time folds back on itself. In trauma, where the past intrudes as if it were present. In deep concentration, where hours collapse into moments. These states feel strange not because they are unreal, but because they sit near the boundary of our usual temporal regime. Our brains are tuned for forward flow. When that tuning loosens, experience becomes boundary-like. Now imagine such boundaries, not inside minds, but in the universe itself. Regions where forward time conditions gradually give way to reverse time or time-neutral regimes. No sharp border, no cosmic signpost, just a slow change in how gradients align. In such regions, observers would experience time differently depending on where they stand. Two beings separated by a small distance could disagree about what came first. Both would be correct locally. Communication between them would be difficult, not because signals fail, but because interpretation fails. Meaning would fracture, not into nonsense, but into incompatibility. Each perspective would be internally consistent, but they would not map cleanly onto each other. This is unsettling because it undermines the idea of a single, global reality. But the universe has never promised global simplicity. It only promises local consistency. At boundaries, local consistency is preserved, but global narratives fail. This suggests that time's arrow is not a universal coordinate. It is a local orientation that can rotate, blur, or dissolve across space and scale. And where orientations differ, boundaries form. These boundaries would be the most interesting places in the universe. Not because they are violent or energetic, but because they expose the underlying structure. They reveal which aspects of reality are fundamental and which are emergent. At a temporal boundary, time itself becomes negotiable. Systems may still function, organization may persist, awareness may arise, but none of these will obey the assumptions we rely on. Memory may partially detach from experience. Causality may operate probabilistically rather than sequentially. Identity may fluctuate, sometimes coherent, sometimes diffuse. From our perspective, such regions might appear hostile to life. But that judgment comes from imagining forward-time life trying to survive there. Life adapted to boundaries would look different. It would not rely on long histories. It would not plan far ahead. It would not define itself rigidly over time. It would exist by responsiveness rather than continuity. Such life might not build civilizations. It might not preserve records. It might not even recognize itself as something that persists. But it could still be aware. And awareness, once it arises, does not care about our preferences for order. This brings us to a deeply personal implication. Our own experience may not be as far from a boundary as we think. We assume we live deep inside a stable temporal regime, but stability is relative. On cosmic scales, even long eras are brief. On fundamental scales, even strong arrows are conditional. We may already be closer to a boundary than we realize. Not spatially, but structurally. The more we rely on memory, prediction, and narrative, the more fragile our sense of reality becomes when those tools falter. And they do falter every night, in sleep. Every time attention collapses inward, every time the present thickens and the story loosens. These moments are not failures of consciousness. They are brushes against the edge. If boundaries are where rules soften, then sleep may be a boundary state, not between waking and unconsciousness, but between narrative time and pattern-based presence. In sleep, the arrow weakens, memory fragments, identity dissolves. Yet experience continues. This may be why sleep feels restorative, not because it advances anything, but because it temporarily releases us from the strain of maintaining a direction. If the universe contains vast boundary regions, then perhaps our minds evolved to touch them safely, briefly, every night, not to escape time, but to rehearse its absence. This is a quiet, unsettling idea, that consciousness itself may need periodic relief from direction, that awareness thrives not only on motion, but on rest within structure. Boundaries offer that rest. They are places where nothing has to go anywhere, And if that is true, then the most fundamental division in the universe may not be between past and future. It may be between regimes that demand direction and regimes that do not. Which leads us to the next question. If boundaries exist between temporal regimes, what determines where they form? Why do some regions develop strong arrows while others remain ambiguous? What sculpts the cosmic landscape into zones of story and zones of silence? To approach that, we must look at something even deeper than instability. We must look at initial conditions, at the quiet biases that shape everything that follows without ever announcing themselves. Initial conditions do not feel dramatic. There is no explosion, no declaration, no visible force announcing that one direction has been chosen over another. Initial conditions simply are quiet biases present before anything begins to resemble a story. And yet, from them, everything follows. We often imagine the beginning of the universe as a moment of creation, a burst of energy tearing reality open. But this image hides something more subtle and far more important. What truly matters is not that the universe began, but how unevenly it began. A perfectly symmetric beginning would have left no trace, no gradients, no preference, no reason for time to lean in any direction. Nothing would have unfolded. But the universe we inhabit did not begin evenly. Tiny irregularities were present from the very start. Slight differences in density, small variations in energy, microscopic asymmetries so minor they seem insignificant until billions of years amplify them into galaxies, stars, and minds. These asymmetries did not dictate outcomes. They tilted probabilities. From those tilts, arrows emerged. Time did not choose a direction. Direction emerged because something, somewhere, was slightly more likely than something else. And once likelihood exists, history can begin. Initial conditions are not causes in the traditional sense. They do not push events forward. They shape the landscape of what can happen easily and what can happen only with difficulty. Think of a marble placed on an uneven surface. The surface does not move the marble. It merely makes some paths smoother than others. Once the marble begins to roll, it feels like motion has direction, but the direction was encoded quietly, long before the motion began. Our universe is rolling on such a surface. The arrow of time is the path of least resistance through possibility. This reframes the dominance of forward time in our region. We are not witnessing a universal law being enforced. We are witnessing a preference being expressed. And preferences can change. If initial conditions define the shape of the landscape, then different regions of the universe may rest on different contours. Some steep, some shallow, some curved, some nearly flat. In regions where the slope is strong, time feels decisive. Memory accumulates. Causality feels strict. Identity hardens. In regions where the slope weakens, time hesitates. Memory blurs. Causality loosens. And in regions where the slope reverses, everything we take for granted turns around not violently, but naturally, following the same logic that governs us here. This is why reverse-time universes are not violations of physics. They are alternative relaxations of initial bias. The universe does not correct them because there is nothing to correct. They are equally valid expressions of the same underlying rules. From our perspective, this idea is unsettling because it removes necessity from our experience. We want time to flow forward because it feels meaningful. It gives structure to effort, reward, and memory. But meaning does not require necessity. It requires coherence, and coherence can arise wherever biases persist long enough to be felt. Initial conditions provide those biases, but they do not lock the universe into a single story forever. As the universe evolves, those initial tilts spread out, gradients flatten, differences soften. The memory of the beginning fades not because time attached a label to it, but because the landscape itself changes. This suggests something quietly profound. The arrow of time is strongest near its origin, not because time itself is strongest there, but because the biases are sharpest. As those biases dissipate, direction loses authority. We may be living in the long afterglow of an initial imbalance, a region where the slope is still noticeable, but slowly smoothing out. And beyond our observable horizon, conditions may already be very different. Some regions may have flattened almost completely. Others may have developed new slopes, new biases, new orientations. The universe may not be aging toward uniformity in a single way. It may be differentiating. This challenges the idea of a single cosmic fate. We often ask how the universe will end: heat death, collapse, silence. These are extrapolations drawn from our local slope, projected outward as if it were universal. If slopes vary, so do endings. Some regions may approach stillness. Some may cycle endlessly. Some may invert. Some may dissolve into regimes where time no longer organizes experience at all. There may be no single ending, only transitions. And this returns us, gently, to ourselves. Our own lives are shaped by initial conditions we did not choose. Genetic biases, environmental gradients, cultural asymmetries. These do not determine our actions, but they tilt the landscape of what feels easy, difficult, meaningful, or inevitable. We move along slopes we rarely notice. And just as with the universe, those slopes can change. Growth, in this sense, is not about fighting the slope. It is about becoming aware of it. Awareness does not remove bias, but it softens its grip. It allows new paths to become visible, even if they remain difficult. Perhaps this is why consciousness evolved, not to escape constraints, but to notice them. If that is true, then our awareness of time's arrow is not a passive observation. It is a clue, a hint that direction is not absolute, that what feels inevitable is often just well supported, and that what feels impossible may simply lie uphill. This prepares us for a final, unsettling inversion. If initial conditions quietly sculpt the arrow of time, if that arrow is local, conditional, and temporary, then the deepest question is no longer about time at all. It is about neutrality. What does the universe look like when all biases finally dissolve? When slopes flatten completely? When no direction is easier than any other? Is that state lifeless? Or is it something stranger, something so balanced that it no longer needs stories to exist? To approach that, we must move toward the quietest idea of all: a universe without preference, a universe without tilt, a universe without an arrow. A universe without preference does not announce itself. There is no collapse, no dramatic silence, no final scene where everything goes dark. A universe without preference is not an ending in the way our stories imagine endings. It is something far quieter, far stranger. It is a state where nothing is easier than anything else. To understand why this matters, we have to let go of one of our deepest habits. We assume that if nothing is favored, nothing happens. That without bias, motion stops. That without direction, existence freezes into emptiness. But this assumption comes from living inside a tilted world. Preference is what creates momentum. When one state is easier to reach than another, systems move. When paths differ in difficulty, stories emerge. We call that motion time. Lokingmarka. Remove preference, and time as we know it dissolves. But dissolution is not annihilation. Imagine standing on a perfectly flat landscape. No hills, no valleys, no slope pulling you in any direction. From where you stand, movement feels pointless. Every step costs the same. There is no reason to go anywhere. And yet, you can still move. Nothing forbids motion. What disappears is motivation, not possibility. A universe without preference would still allow configurations to exist. Particles could still arrange themselves. Fields could still fluctuate. Information could still exist. What would vanish is the bias that makes one change more likely than another. From inside such a universe, the feeling of inevitability would disappear. Not the feeling of existence, just inevitability. This distinction is subtle, but it changes everything. We equate meaning with direction because meaning, for us, is built from effort. Effort implies resistance. Resistance implies slope. Slope implies preference. But meaning does not require effort. Meaning requires relation. Even in a perfectly neutral universe, relations could exist. Structures could hold. Patterns could persist, not because they are pushed forward or pulled backward, but because nothing dissolves them preferentially. Such a universe would not evolve, but it would not decay either. It would hover. From our perspective, this sounds like stagnation, like boredom stretched across eternity. But boredom is a reaction to blocked desire, and desire is born from imbalance. In a universe without preference, desire would not arise in the form we know it. Awareness might. Consider again the idea of a standing wave. It does not travel, it does not progress, yet it is alive with motion. Energy flows through it continuously, perfectly balanced. The pattern exists not because something is happening to it, but because everything that happens cancels out. A neutral universe might be filled with such standing patterns, not frozen, balanced. And if awareness arises from sensitivity to internal difference rather than external progression, then such patterns could host experience. Experience without narrative, presence without anticipation, awareness without urgency. This is difficult to imagine because our own awareness is constantly pulled forward by bias. We are always leaning into the next moment, the next thought, the next breath. Even rest is framed as preparation for movement. In a universe without preference, there would be no next, only variation within a holding structure. This raises a question that feels almost forbidden. Is time itself a symptom of impatience? Not emotional impatience, but physical impatience. The inability of a system to remain balanced. The tendency of asymmetry to amplify. The failure of neutrality to persist. If neutrality could persist perfectly, time might never arise. And perhaps, somewhere beyond the regimes we can observe, neutrality does persist, not as emptiness, but as completeness. This idea reframes the concept of an ultimate state of the universe. We often imagine the end as heat death, a universe where everything is spread out, cold and inert. But heat death still assumes preference. It assumes entropy dominates. It assumes dispersion is favored. A truly neutral universe would not favor dispersion or concentration. It would not favor change or stasis. It would favor nothing, which means it would not favor non-existence either. Existence would not be driven toward disappearance. It would simply remain allowed. From within such a universe, the question, what happens next, would make no sense. There is no next. There is only coexistence. This sounds peaceful, but also unsettling, because it removes the tension that gives our lives shape. We care because things can be lost. We act because moments pass. We choose because futures differ. Remove preference, and those pressures dissolve. Does meaning dissolve with them? Or does meaning transform? In a neutral universe, meaning would not be built from outcome. It would not be measured by impact or legacy. It would not be anchored to past or future. Meaning would exist as alignment. A pattern would be meaningful if it fits. An experience would be meaningful if it resonates. Awareness would be meaningful simply by existing within coherence. This is not a lesser meaning. It is a different one. We struggle with this idea because our own existence is so clearly biased. We live inside a strong arrow. Everything about us, biology, psychology, culture, is shaped by preference. We are creatures of slope. But that does not mean slope is fundamental. It means slope is fertile. A neutral universe would not easily produce creatures like us. It would not generate long histories, complex narratives, or urgent selves. But it might produce other forms of awareness, ones that do not need stories to feel complete. This forces a difficult inversion. Perhaps the universe did not begin neutral and then become biased. Perhaps neutrality is the rare state. Perhaps bias is what emerges most easily, because perfect balance is fragile. Any tiny deviation breaks neutrality, and once broken, it amplifies. Slopes form, time begins, stories unfold. In that sense, time is not the default. It is the scar left by imbalance, and we live inside that scar. This casts our entire experience in a new light. Our lives feel dramatic because we are living in a region where neutrality failed, where preference took hold strongly enough to produce stars, planets, chemistry, biology, minds. We are not evidence that the universe prefers meaning. We are evidence that meaning can arise when preference exists. If the universe ever returns to neutrality, if all biases eventually dissolve, then our mode of existence may not survive that transition, not because it is punished, but because it depends on tilt. And that brings us to the most intimate question yet. Forward time, memory, identity, causality, and story all depend on preference. Then what is the deepest thing about us that does not? What part of experience could remain even if all slopes flattened? What survives when time no longer flows? This question does not point outward. It points inward, toward the quietest layer of awareness, the layer that notices without needing things to go anywhere. To reach it, we must let go of the idea that existence must justify itself through motion. We must ask whether awareness itself could be the final structure present, even when everything else loses direction. And that is where the next movement begins. There is something that remains when motion loses its authority. It is not memory. It is not identity. It is not narrative, purpose, or direction. It is awareness before it chooses a story. We rarely encounter this layer because our lives are saturated with movement. Thoughts move. Time moves. Emotions move. Even stillness is usually framed as a pause between motions, a preparation for what comes next. We are trained to experience awareness as something that travels, but awareness itself does not move. What moves are the contents that pass through it. This distinction is subtle, and because it is subtle, it is easy to miss. Yet it may be the most stable feature of existence we ever encounter. Consider the moment just before sleep fully takes you. Thoughts begin to loosen. Images drift without sequence. Time becomes unreliable. Memory stops stacking cleanly. And yet, something remains unmistakably present. You are still aware, not of anything in particular, not moving toward anything, just aware. This awareness does not feel like an object. It does not feel like a process unfolding. It feels more like a field, a capacity to register whatever happens to arise, without insisting that it go anywhere. This is not mystical language. It is descriptive. Awareness, stripped of story, behaves very differently from consciousness as we usually understand it. It does not need time to flow forward. It does not need a past to compare against or a future to anticipate. It does not need preference. It only needs coherence. In a universe where time weakens, where preference dissolves, where slopes flatten, this kind of awareness could remain untouched, not because it resists change, but because it was never built from change in the first place. This suggests something quietly radical. Perhaps awareness is not produced by time. Perhaps time is produced by the way awareness organizes instability. When conditions favor motion, awareness binds itself to memory, identity, and narrative. It becomes a self moving through a story. But when those conditions soften, awareness does not disappear. It simplifies. It releases the structures that depended on direction and remains as bare presence. This may explain why we instinctively associate silence with depth, why stillness feels meaningful even when nothing is happening, why moments without progress can feel fuller than moments packed with activity. We are touching a layer that does not need justification through motion. This layer does not care whether time flows forward, backward, or not at all. It is compatible with any regime because it does not rely on direction. From the universe's perspective, this kind of awareness may be the most robust thing it ever produces. Stars burn out, galaxies disperse, time's arrow weakens. But wherever organization persists long enough to support sensitivity even briefly, awareness can arise. And when organization dissolves, awareness does not necessarily collapse with it. It may simply lose its attachments. This reframes the idea of survival. We often think survival means continuation across time, persisting as the same identity, carrying memory forward, leaving traces behind. But that definition assumes a strong arrow of time. In a universe where time fades, survival may not mean persistence. It may mean availability, the capacity for awareness to arise again and again wherever conditions permit, without needing to be the same instance, the same story, or the same self. From this perspective, the fear of time reversing loses its sharp edge. If time flowed backward, identities would unravel, memories would dissolve, stories would unwrite themselves. Awareness, the raw capacity to experience, would not be threatened by that unraveling. It would simply no longer be occupied with holding a direction together. This is not comfort in the usual sense. It does not promise that anything we recognize will last, but it suggests that existence is not as fragile as our narratives make it seem. What is fragile is not awareness. What is fragile is the shape awareness takes when bound to preference. This brings us to a quiet turning point. We began with a question about the universe, about stars forming from ash, about memory appearing before experience, about death becoming a beginning. But underneath all of those images was a deeper concern. What happens to meaning when direction disappears? What happens to us? The answer may be that we as stories do not survive, but awareness does not require us to. It requires only that something is happening, even if that something does not go anywhere. In a universe without preference, awareness would not strive. It would not accumulate. It would not fear loss, because there would be nothing to lose. It would simply register. This is not emptiness. It is fullness without motion, and perhaps that is why the idea feels unsettling. We are so accustomed to proving our existence through movement that the idea of existing without it feels like erasure. But erasure only applies to things written in time. Awareness may not be written at all. This realization quietly reframes death. If awareness is not dependent on narrative continuity, then the end of a story is not the end of presence. It is the end of a particular organization of experience. In a reverse-time universe, death would feel like an origin because organization would emerge from simplicity. In a neutral universe, death might not exist as a concept at all, only transitions between patterns. And in our universe, where time flows strongly forward, death feels final because narrative dominates. But narrative is not the deepest layer. This does not answer the question of what lies beyond. It changes the question itself. Instead of asking where time is going, we begin to ask what remains when direction no longer matters. And what remains is not a thing. It is the capacity to experience. This brings us very close to the quiet end of our journey. Not an ending that concludes, but one that releases. If awareness is the most resilient structure the universe produces, then perhaps the universe is not trying to go anywhere. Perhaps it is simply exploring the many ways awareness can arise under different conditions. Forward time is one way, reverse time is another, timeless resonance is another still. and none of them are privileged. They are expressions. To complete this movement, we need to step back one final time, not to add another idea, but to let the ideas we have already touched settle into a single, quiet question, one that does not demand an answer, one that is meant to remain open. Silence is not the absence of activity, it is the absence of insistence. When we imagine the universe without motion, without time's arrow, without preference, we often imagine emptiness, a blankness where nothing occurs, nothing matters, nothing can be felt. But this image comes from a mind trained to equate existence with momentum. Silence, at its deepest level, is not nothing. It is equilibrium that no longer needs to announce itself. In a universe where biases dissolve, where slopes flatten, where no direction is favored, activity does not vanish. It becomes evenly distributed. Every fluctuation is met with an equal counter-fluctuation. Every difference is absorbed without amplification. From the outside, such a universe looks still. From the inside, it may feel complete. This distinction matters because it reveals something we rarely acknowledge. We confuse noise with life. We assume that without contrast, experience collapses. But contrast is not the only way to register existence. Resonance is another. Imagine a bell struck once, ringing in perfect balance, sustained not by repeated blows, but by its own internal symmetry. The sound does not progress. It does not build toward anything. It simply exists, held in place by the precise alignment of forces. A universe without preference may be filled with such resonances. Sounds, not motions, but configurations that sustain themselves without drifting. In such a universe, awareness would not be pulled forward or backward. It would not chase outcomes or reconstruct histories. It would rest within the structure that supports it. This kind of awareness would not feel asleep. It would feel settled. We struggle to imagine this because our own awareness is rarely allowed to settle. Even in rest, we are usually anticipating the next disturbance. Even in calm, we are oriented toward what might change. Our experience is shaped by instability. But instability is not the only substrate for experience. Stability, when it is dynamic rather than rigid, can support awareness just as well. The difference is subtle. Rigid stability collapses awareness. Nothing registers because nothing responds. Dynamic stability sustains awareness because small fluctuations occur but never grow large enough to disrupt coherence. This is the kind of balance found in living systems at rest. Heartbeat steady, breathing slow, neural activity synchronized rather than chaotic. In these moments, awareness does not disappear. It deepens. Perhaps this is why silence feels profound rather than empty. It is not the absence of sensation. It is the absence of pressure. In a universe where time no longer insists on direction, where narratives dissolve, silence would not be a void. It would be the dominant texture of existence, and texture can be experienced. This challenges the fear that a universe without time would be lifeless. Life, as we define it, depends on gradients, but experience does not necessarily require life in that form. It requires sensitivity within structure. A neutral universe could support awareness that does not struggle, does not strive, does not accumulate. Awareness that simply is. From our perspective, this sounds eerily like death. But death feels frightening because it represents the collapse of narrative identity, the loss of memory, the end of direction. We project that loss onto existence itself and assume nothing remains. But narrative identity is not awareness. It is a configuration awareness temporarily inhabits. When configuration dissolves, awareness does not need to vanish. It may simply stop expressing itself as a self. This does not mean personal survival in the way we usually mean it. It does not promise continuation of personality, memory, or story. It suggests something quieter. That existence may not need to justify itself through continuity. In a universe without preference, there would be no urgency to persist, because nothing would be pulling experience toward disappearance. There would be no fear of loss, because nothing would be singled out to be lost. Everything allowed would remain allowed. This is difficult to accept because we are shaped by scarcity. Scarcity of time, scarcity of opportunity, scarcity of attention. These scarcities make things precious, but preciousness is not the same as meaning. Meaning can arise from coherence alone. A perfectly balanced pattern does not need to be rare to be meaningful. It needs only to fit. This reframes the idea of a final state of the universe. Instead of imagining an end where everything dies, we can imagine a settling where everything stops needing to go anywhere. Not frozen, at rest. Rest not as collapse, but as fulfillment. This is not an argument that the universe will reach such a state. It is an exploration of what such a state would be if it exists. And it reveals something important. Our fear of timelessness is not a fear of nothingness. It is a fear of not being needed, of not having to move, choose, strive, or become. But need is not a prerequisite for existence. It is a feature of imbalance. If the universe ever reaches neutrality, it will not need us. But it will not exclude awareness either. Awareness may simply no longer organize itself around selves like us. This is where the idea turns inward again. We touch small hints of this neutrality in our own experience, in moments of deep rest where nothing feels required, in moments where presence feels sufficient, in moments where the urge to do dissolves, but awareness remains bright. These moments are not failures of motivation. They are glimpses of a mode of being that does not rely on preference. Perhaps that is why they feel both peaceful and unsettling. They show us that the self we protect so carefully is not the foundation of experience. It is one way experience arranges itself when time leans strongly in one direction. If that lean softens, the self loosens, and awareness remains. This brings us near the end of the arc we began with. We imagined time flowing backward. We imagined memory before experience. We imagined death as origin, and step by step, we stripped away assumptions until we reached something that does not depend on direction at all. What remains is not a conclusion. It is a quiet plateau, a place where questions stop pushing and simply hover. If such a plateau exists in the universe, it would not be dramatic. It would not announce itself as an end. It would simply be the absence of further bias. And from within it, the universe would not feel finished. It would feel sufficient. This leaves us with one final movement. If neutrality is possible, if awareness can exist without direction, then what brings direction back? What restarts the story? What causes a universe that has settled to ever lean again? To explore that, we must consider the possibility that neutrality itself may be unstable, that perfect balance may not be able to hold forever, and that even silence may eventually crack. Perfect balance cannot defend itself. It looks complete. It feels final. From within, it seems as though nothing more is required. But completeness is not immunity. In the deepest layers of reality, even neutrality carries a vulnerability. Not to force, not to intention, but to possibility. A perfectly balanced state is silent, but it is also exposed. With no preference to reinforce itself, it has no resistance to deviation. Any fluctuation, no matter how small, is not pushed back or amplified. It is simply allowed, and allowance is enough. This is the quiet reason why neutrality may never last forever. Not because something breaks it, but because nothing protects it. In a universe without preference, all configurations are equally permitted. That equality sounds stable, but it removes the bias that would keep the universe hovering in one arrangement. Without a slope, there is no restoring force. Without a restoring force, even the smallest deviation can persist. This is not instability in the explosive sense. It is vulnerability in the mathematical sense. A balanced pencil standing perfectly upright is neutral. No direction is favored. But that neutrality cannot endure. The slightest vibration, the faintest air current, the smallest uncertainty will tip it. Not because gravity suddenly appears, but because gravity was always there, waiting for a direction to matter. Neutrality does not erase the rules. It only suspends their preference. And suspension is not permanence. If such a neutral universe existed, it would not need a cause to leave neutrality. It would only need a fluctuation that fails to cancel itself. Once that happens, preference reappears. Not dramatically, not globally. Locally, a tiny tilt forms somewhere in the landscape. A direction becomes slightly easier than another. A configuration becomes marginally more likely. And from that microscopic asymmetry, a new arrow can emerge. Time begins again. Not as a reset, not as a restart, but as a gentle lean. This suggests something profoundly cyclical, but not in the simple sense of repetition. The universe may move through regimes, strong arrows, weak arrows, neutral plateaus, new arrows forming in unexpected orientations, not looping through the same story, but exploring different ways of organizing experience. Forward time is one chapter. Reverse time is another. Timeless resonance is another still. None are final. None are privileged. They are phases of sensitivity to imbalance. This reframes the fear of ultimate stillness. Even if the universe were to settle into neutrality, that state would not be a tomb. It would be a pause with no obligation to remain paused. Silence, in this view, is not an ending. It is an interval, and intervals, by their nature, are surrounded by change. This means that the universe may never reach a final state in the way our narratives imagine. Not eternal motion, not eternal rest, but an ongoing negotiation between imbalance and neutrality. Time emerges where imbalance persists. Timelessness emerges where balance holds. And transitions occur where balance fails. This dynamic does not require an external clock. It does not require a metatime beyond time. It is simply the expression of constraint and allowance playing out endlessly. From this perspective, the universe is not going anywhere. It is trying out ways of being. And awareness may be the thread that persists through all of them, not as a single observer, not as a memory-carrying self, but as a capacity that reappears wherever organization becomes sensitive enough. This is why awareness feels ancient, not old in years, but old in possibility. It does not belong to one arrow or one story. It belongs to the transitions, to the moments where structure holds just long enough to feel itself before dissolving again. This brings the idea of rebirth into a strange new light. Not rebirth of selves, not reincarnation of narratives, but recurrence of awareness under new conditions. Each time preference reappears, experience organizes itself again. Each time a slope forms, stories can be told. Each time neutrality cracks, direction is born. And each time direction fades, awareness remains available for something else. This is not comforting in the traditional sense. It does not promise continuity of identity. It does not guarantee meaning will look familiar. But it suggests that existence is not fragile. Stories are fragile. Selves are fragile. Arrows are fragile. But the capacity for experience is not tied to any one of them. If neutrality is unstable, then silence is not permanent. And if silence is not permanent, then time is not a one-time accident. It may be an ongoing phenomenon, arising, fading, reorienting, across scales so vast that any single arrow feels like a local weather pattern rather than a cosmic rule. This idea changes how we think about beginnings and endings. There may be no first time, no last time, only transitions between regimes of sensitivity, and within those regimes, awareness blooms in forms suited to the local conditions. We are one such bloom, shaped by a strong forward arrow, dependent on memory, attached to narrative, terrified of stillness. But stillness is not our enemy. It is simply a regime we are not built to inhabit for long. This brings us to the quietest realization yet. If time can arise, fade, reverse, and reappear, if awareness can persist across these shifts, then the universe is not a story with a beginning and an end. It is a breathing structure, not inhaling and exhaling in rhythm, but allowing imbalance and balance to alternate without preference for either. And perhaps that is the deepest reason the universe feels alive. Not because it moves, but because it never fully settles. As you listen now, time still feels present. Thoughts still unfold. Words still arrive in sequence. The arrow remains strong enough to carry this experience forward. But beneath that flow, another understanding has taken shape. That the arrow is not eternal. That stillness is not death. That silence is not final. And that even when everything seems to rest, something remains capable of leaning again. Which leaves us with the last turning of this exploration. Not toward a conclusion, but toward a return. If time can disappear and reappear, if direction can be lost and found, then what does it mean that here and now, time feels so certain? Why does this arrow feel so convincing? And what does that say about where we are standing in the universe at this moment? Time feels certain because it is working, not because it is true in some absolute sense, but because here and now, it is effective. It aligns enough gradients, holds enough patterns together, and supports enough continuity for experience to feel stable. The arrow convinces us because it performs its task quietly and consistently. We rarely question a structure that holds. We question only when it fails. In this region of the universe, time's arrow does not hesitate. Memory accumulates. Causes appear before effects. Identity persists long enough to feel solid. Stories make sense. Effort appears to lead somewhere. Loss feels irreversible. Birth feels like a beginning. Death feels like an ending. All of this coherence gives time an authority that feels unquestionable. Authority is not fundamentality. It is functionality. The arrow of time feels real because it solves problems. It allows energy to flow predictably. It allows information to be stored. It allows complexity to arise and persist. It allows organisms to adapt. It allows minds to plan, regret, hope, and remember. Time earns our trust by being useful, and usefulness is a powerful illusion. Consider how gravity feels absolute when you are standing on the ground. It defines your sense of up and down. It shapes your body, your movement, your architecture. It feels like a universal truth until you leave the surface. Then gravity does not vanish. It reveals itself as local. Time may be similar. We are standing on a surface where temporal gravity is strong. It pulls everything in one direction. We build our entire sense of reality around it. And because we cannot step outside it, we mistake it for the shape of existence itself. But the universe is larger than any surface. The certainty we feel about time is not evidence that time must always behave this way. It is evidence that, right now, we are located in a region where forward flow is supported, reinforced, and maintained. This is not accidental. Complex structures like stars, planets, chemistry, biology, and minds do not arise easily. They require sustained gradients. They require reliable asymmetry. They require a direction that does not fluctuate too wildly. Forward time provides exactly that. It creates a stable environment for complexity to climb, layer by layer, without constantly undoing itself. It gives processes room to accumulate. It allows memory to anchor identity. It allows cause and effect to be trusted. In other words, forward time is not just a condition we happen to experience. It is a condition that makes experiencing anything like us possible at all. This leads to a sobering realization. We are not neutral observers of time. We are products of it. Our bodies are built to metabolize forward. Our brains are built to remember backward and anticipate forward. Our language is built around sequences. Our values are built around outcomes. Our emotions are built around loss and hope. If time behaved differently here, we would not be here to notice it. This does not mean time is necessary. It means we are conditional. The arrow feels convincing because it is the reason we exist in this form, which raises an unsettling inversion. Perhaps time does not exist because it is fundamental. Perhaps it exists because it is fertile. Fertile conditions spread. Regions of the universe where time flows smoothly forward are better at producing complexity than regions where time hesitates or reverses. Complexity increases the number of interactions, the number of structures, the number of observers. From a purely statistical perspective, observers are more likely to find themselves in regions where observation is possible. So we find ourselves here, not because the universe prefers forward time, but because forward time prefers complexity. This does not make our experience false. It makes it situated. We are standing inside a temporal greenhouse, warmed by a strong arrow, surrounded by structures that depend on it. From inside, the arrow feels absolute. From outside, it is one climate among many. This perspective reframes certainty itself. Certainty does not come from truth. It comes from compatibility. Time feels certain because it fits us perfectly. But fit is not proof of universality. This is why imagining reversed or neutral time feels so difficult. Not because it is impossible, but because our minds are optimized for this arrow. Asking them to imagine otherwise is like asking lungs to imagine breathing water. The resistance we feel is not philosophical. It is biological. This also explains why time feels emotional. We grieve because we believe moments cannot return. We fear because we believe futures are uncertain. We love because we believe presence is temporary. These emotions are not flaws. They are adaptations to a one-way flow. In a reverse time universe, emotions would not disappear. They would reorganize. Attachment would point in a different direction. Fear would attach to different transitions. Love would be shaped by release rather than accumulation. In a neutral time regime, emotions as we know them might not arise at all. Because experience is empty, but because urgency is absent. Our emotional landscape is sculpted by the arrow just as much as our cognitive one. This is why the arrow feels personal. It is not just a feature of the universe. It is the condition of our inner lives. And yet, recognizing this does something important. It loosens the grip of inevitability. If time's authority comes from usefulness rather than fundamentality, then its certainty is provisional, strong where conditions support it, weak where they do not. We can trust it here without worshiping it everywhere. This balance matters. When we mistake local conditions for universal truths, we become rigid. We insist that reality must always make sense in our terms. We panic when it does not. We cling to narratives even as they strain. But if we recognize that our certainty is contextual, something softens. We can allow for other modes of existence without needing to assimilate them into our own. We can accept that our story is not the only one the universe tells. This acceptance does not diminish our experience. It deepens it, because it reframes meaning as something that arises within conditions, not something guaranteed by the structure of reality itself. Meaning exists because time flows forward here, not because meaning is universal, and that makes meaning more fragile. but also more precious. A flower blooms because the climate supports it. That does not make the flower illusory. It makes it contingent. Our lives are like that. Time gives us the illusion of permanence while it lasts, but it also gives us the intensity of impermanence. We care because things move away from us. We act because moments pass. If time were reversed or neutral, caring would take a different shape. But caring would still exist, because awareness, once present, cannot help but respond to the structures it inhabits. This brings us to the edge of return. We began by imagining time flowing backward. We explored memory, causality, identity, change, structure, neutrality, awareness, silence, and renewal. And now we arrive back at where we started. Here, in a universe where time flows forward, in a body that ages, in a mind that remembers, in a moment that feels unmistakably real. Nothing in this exploration asks you to deny that reality. It asks you to locate it, to see that the certainty you feel is not proof that other possibilities are wrong. It is proof that you are standing in a place where this possibility works. Time is doing its job, and because it is doing its job, you can rest inside it for now. But rest does not require ignorance. You can allow the arrow to carry you without believing it is the only river. You can live your story fully while knowing it is one expression among many. This awareness does not pull you out of time. It grounds you within it. Because if time is local, then this moment is local too. And locality does not make things small. It makes them intimate. The present you are experiencing is not the present of the entire universe. It is your present, shaped by a particular arrow, on a particular slope, under particular conditions that will not last forever. And that is exactly why it matters. This realization does not conclude anything. It prepares the final quiet movement. If time feels certain because it is working, if the arrow holds because it supports complexity, if awareness arises because conditions allow it, then the last question is not about the universe at all. It is about listening, about what happens when you stop trying to follow the arrow and simply notice the flow you are already inside, not to escape it, not to reverse it, but to rest with it. That is where this journey gently resolves. The last movement does not arrive like an ending. There is no closure waiting here, no final answer rising to meet the question. What appears instead is a soft return, a quiet recognition that nothing has been resolved and nothing needs to be. Time is still moving, not because it must, not because it always will, but because here it can. You are still inside the arrow. Thoughts continue to unfold. Sensations drift in and out. The body remains oriented toward a future it cannot see and a past it can no longer touch. This orientation feels natural again, almost comforting after wandering so far from it. Something subtle has changed. The arrow no longer feels absolute. It feels local. It feels like a condition you are inhabiting rather than a rule that defines everything. And that distinction matters. Because when time is no longer mistaken for a universal truth, it becomes something gentler, something you can move with instead of against, something that carries experience without demanding belief. The universe does not need time to justify itself. It does not need direction to exist. But here, in this region, under these conditions, time flows forward, and awareness takes shape inside that flow. That is enough. We often imagine that understanding the universe should strip life of its mystery, that if we loosen the arrow, dissolve causality, soften identity, and release narrative, something essential will be lost. But nothing has been taken away. What has been removed is the pressure to explain existence in a single way. Time may flow forward here, but elsewhere it may hesitate, reverse, or dissolve entirely. Awareness may arise in stories like ours, or in patterns without sequence, or in silences that never become histories. None of these invalidate the others. They coexist, not in time, but in possibility. This is the quiet truth that remains. The universe is not committed to one experience of itself. It experiments, it leans, it relaxes. It allows, and wherever conditions permit sensitivity to arise, something notices. That noticing does not need to last forever to be real. It only needs to happen. Perhaps this is why the present feels so intimate. Not because it is the only moment that exists, but because it is the only place where awareness touches conditions directly. The present is where the universe meets itself locally. Right now, in this breath, in this pause, in this drifting attention that no longer needs to chase answers. Time has not stopped, but it has stopped asking you to believe in it as the whole truth. You can let it move. You can let memories settle behind you. You can let the future remain undefined. And none of that threatens awareness. Awareness was never moving in the first place. It was only attending. If, somewhere in the universe, time flows backward, then stars are being born from their ashes. Memories are forming before experiences, and endings are quietly becoming beginnings. If, somewhere else, time does not flow at all, then presence rests without urgency, sustained by balance rather than motion. And here time flows forward, carrying stories like yours, fragile and vivid and unrepeatable. None of these modes are wrong. They are expressions. What matters is not which one is true. What matters is that you are inside one now, listening, letting thoughts slow, letting certainty soften into something quieter. There is nothing you need to conclude, nothing you need to decide. The universe is still turning, whether time moves forward, backward, or not at all. And awareness is still available, wherever structure allows it to appear. So close your eyes if you wish, not to escape time, not to chase answers, just to rest inside the flow that is carrying this moment gently onward. Whatever direction it chooses next,